that's the sex ratio hypothesis.
Yeah.
And the reverse happens, right? That you see whoever the more scarce sex is gets to determine the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. So the men, if they are in high demand because there's short supply, you get more short-term mating.
Yeah.
You get an increase in relationship dissatisfaction from women. And when the reverse happens, you get more dates before sex. You get more long-term mating. You also get more sexual violence in that situation as well, when there is a surplus of men and a scarcity of women. I think there's something...
You also get far more unstable societies. You know, I was pilloried a few years back for my comments about enforced monogamy because they were taken out of context and twisted in exactly the way that things like that get twisted now. But
what did you mean by that?
I mean that one human universal is the construction of societies to both mandate and reward monogamy. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's because it's the best long-term solution, fundamentally. But one of the reasons for that is that when women are scarce, men get violent. Now, you know, that was read to say, well, I thought that this society should be distributing women to undeserving men, which is, of course, absolutely and utterly preposterous and bears no relationship whatsoever to anything I ever said or thought, or anything anyone sane would ever think or say, or has ever thought or said. Because I don't know anyone politically ever who was insane enough to think that the state should distribute women to men. Like, that's just never happened. So to be accused of that belief, and then for that to, you know, be put forward as a credible representation of what I thought was just one of the preposterous things that has happened to me.
It's an unfortunate name, enforced monogamy, because it's a term from anthropology, right? But what you mean is culturally celebrated monogamy, culturally and norms that are supporting people and raising that up as an institution.
Supporting and punishing, both, but mostly supporting. I mean, the punishing is that there's a moral disapproval applied to, say, cheating, right? To adultery, to especially running around behind your partner's back if you're married, particularly that. But even if you're in a long-term stable relationship, it's like, well, that's all enforcement. It's not police with jackboots, but that's not the only type of enforcement. It's not the only type of sanction or threat or punishment or disappropriation or disgust or contempt or shame or frustration or disappointment, all of those things. And all of that because monogamy is a good long-term solution, but in some sense a troublesome short-term solution if you have other options. Then all of those elements of social support, let's say, need to be put into place. And that is it, as far as I've been able to determine by looking at the anthropological literature. Norms surrounding monogamy are a human universal. There are exceptions, but there are very specific situational reasons for those exceptions. So,
you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30. So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, so this is, somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. You know, the first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. And so that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? Hey, fair enough. And et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. For example, I worked as a daycare worker way back when, that was like probably 80, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. I worked for social services in Alberta in the childcare department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms, high-end law firms, and said, send us your most productive people, and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people, because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30. And all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this, because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? Just being greedy capitalists is enough. They don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They were in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you.
But the problem that you have now is that as women are getting better educated, with more employment, more status, more prestige, they compete themselves out of their ability to find an attractive mate. As women raise up through the dominance hierarchy, and this is
competence hierarchy.
Competence hierarchy, sorry.